Et c'est un grand honneur pour nous tous au Collège de France d'accueillir Joël Mokyr. Joël est certainement le plus grand historien économique vivant de l'innovation et de la croissance. Le 13 octobre, ma grande joie, enfin, il y a eu beaucoup de bonnes nouvelles le 13 octobre, il y avait la libération des otages à Gaza, c'était une grande nouvelle, mais l'autre très grande nouvelle, c'est que une très bonne nouvelle était partagée avec Joël. Et donc, pour moi, c'était formidable que la joie du 13 octobre soit partagée pleinement avec Joël Mokyr. En particulier, c'est Joël qui a développé l'explication la plus plausible du décollage de la croissance et pourquoi il a eu lieu en Europe en 1820 et pas ailleurs. Par exemple, pourquoi il n'a pas eu lieu en Chine. Auparavant, la Chine est un pays d'invention, bien avant nous. Et pourtant, le décollage de la croissance, c'est un phénomène récent qui s'est produit en Europe. Pourquoi c'est le cas? Et c'est vraiment Joël qui a développé l'explication la plus plausible de pourquoi le décollage si récemment est en Europe. Il l'a développé autour de la notion de connaissance utile. En anglais, useful knowledge. Alors là, il y a un passage du jury Nobel que je vais lire en anglais parce que c'est comme ça qu'il a été écrit par le jury Nobel pour expliquer pourquoi ils ont attribué le prix Nobel à Joël. Donc là, je lis une petite phrase en anglais. Joël Mokyr has demonstrated that a continual flow of useful knowledge is necessary for growth to occur. Useful knowledge has two components. One is prescription knowledge, practical instruction, drawings and recipes that describe how something works. C'est le savoir-faire, en fait. C'est les technologies, c'est ce qu'on décrit dans les encyclopédies. Comment faire les choses. The other component is propositional knowledge, the understanding of natural laws and principles that show why something works. Le savoir fondamental, et c'est l'articulation des deux qui pousse l'innovation et qui pousse la croissance. Before the Industrial Revolution, c'est toujours le jury Nobel, propositional knowledge was often lacking or insufficiently diffused. Et donc Joël explique dans ses travaux pourquoi c'est au XIXe siècle que l'articulation de ces deux composantes du useful knowledge a vraiment lieu et que ça déclenche la croissance. Moi, dans le cours que j'avais, peut-être certains d'entre vous ont suivi mes cours, et on a beaucoup parlé de Joël, et on a beaucoup suivi, surtout cette année, mais chaque année. Et quand je mentionne la croissance schumpeterienne, je vous dis qu'il y a toujours trois idées de base. Un, c'est que l'innovation de long terme, la croissance de long terme est tirée par l'innovation cumulative, où chaque innovateur bâtit sur les innovations qui ont précédé. La deuxième chose, c'est que l'innovation, elle est souvent le fait d'entrepreneurs qui poursuivent des investissements d'innovation parce qu'ils veulent être récompensés, ils veulent avoir des rentes d'innovation. Et la troisième, c'est la destruction créatrice, c'est-à-dire le nouveau remplace l'ancien. Eh bien, c'est vraiment Joël qui a expliqué pourquoi ces trois conditions étaient remplies en Europe au début du 19e siècle. L'innovation cumulative, c'est l'encyclopédie, c'est les universités ouvertes, c'est la poste, c'est tout ce qui permet l'échange des idées et qui existe en Europe beaucoup plus qu'ailleurs. Le fait qu'il y ait des rentes d'innovation, c'est en Angleterre puis en France. En Angleterre, il y a la Glorious Revolution. En France, il y a la Révolution française et Napoléon qui sécurisent les droits de propriété. Et c'est à partir du moment où on peut avoir des droits de propriété sécurisés qu'on peut avoir un système de brevets et un système qui récompense l'innovation. Et la destruction créatrice, Joël explique également la concurrence entre pays européens. Souvent, le problème de nouveaux innovants, c'est que les innovateurs d'hier les empêchent d'innover parce qu'ils veulent garder le monopole. Mais Joël explique très bien, si je suis empêché en France, je peux immigrer en Suisse ou en Angleterre. Il y a cette multiplicité de pays, il n'y avait rien de tel en Chine qui permet la destruction créatrice. Et donc, Joël nous offre les clés pour comprendre. J'ai presque terminé. Joël naît à Leyde, aux Pays-Bas, de parents qui ont survécu à la Shoah. Il a ensuite grandi en Israël. Il obtient un bachelor degree en économie et histoire de l'université hébraïque de Jérusalem en 68 et un doctorat d'économie en 74 à l'université de Yale. Joël est l'auteur de nombreuses publications, plus de 200 articles et livres, 10-15 livres majeurs, en particulier The Lever of Riches, The Gifts of Athena, The Enlightened Economy, où il analyse le rôle des Lumières dans l'essor économique britannique. Il a reçu de nombreux doctorats honoris causa. Il est membre étranger de l'Académie royale néerlandaise des arts et des sciences. En 2006, il obtient le prix biennal Heineken pour l'histoire de l'Académie royale néerlandaise des arts et des sciences. En 2015, il obtient le très prestigieux prix international Balzane pour l'histoire économique, qui est le meilleur prix en histoire économique. Et puis en 2025, il obtient donc le prix Nobel d'économie. J'avais promis Joël à mes auditeurs, tous les gens qui ont suivi mes cours, j'avais promis que Joël viendrait vous parler directement. Et c'est un bonheur d'avoir Joël à Paris. Et sans plus tarder, Joël, je te cède la parole.
Thank you, Philippe, for that very generous introduction. I apologize for not giving this lecture en français. I did study French in high school for many years, and I can actually read it and speak it sort of, but I don't think for a lecture it probably would be pretentious. I do want to talk today about some new work which is connected to but different from the work that Philippe was describing. I'm going to talk about Britain and the Industrial Revolution. And I must say, you know, France has always had a fascination with the British Industrial Revolution. At the time as well, but certainly historiographically, some of the finest books written about the British Industrial Revolution were written by people like Paul Mantoux and François Crouzet and many others. And even at the time, France had a real interest in what was happening in Britain. I think not altogether sympathetic, you know, they were worried about Britain gathering strength and wealth, particularly because the two countries were at war, certainly during the sort of central years of the Industrial Revolution, but also because there was some kind of jealousy, and France did everything it could, both in the 18th and 19th century, to follow Britain and you know, see what they were doing and do what they sort of copy them in some ways. The other reason that I think everybody should be interested in the British Industrial Revolution, and this is an analogy I have made before, and it probably gets me into trouble. But I have always defined Britain as the holy land of industrialism. And I compare it to the role of Palestine in the rise of Christianity, which is, it's quite clear that that is where it all started. And then it started spreading and spreading and spreading. And eventually the place where it spread would no longer remain in a leading position. And you know, and Palestine was not a particularly Christian country through most of its history, but it is where it started. If you want to understand where the Industrial Revolution comes from, you really should look at the conditions in Palestine in the years before the appearance of Jesus. So in that sense, I think everybody should be interested in the Industrial Revolution, simply because modern economic growth worldwide today started with the Industrial Revolution. So this is joint work with two of my colleagues, both of them Irishmen for some reason, Cormac O'Grada and Morgan Kelly. And this is a bunch of articles we've written, and we're working on a book now that I would have said will appear in 2026, but I think that's probably overly optimistic. So maybe 2027. Hold on to that, okay? And so, but here's why the Industrial Revolution matters, to repeat. It created what we call the Great Enrichment, okay? So there is essentially a rising tide that raised ships all over the world. Even in very poor countries today, living standards are vastly higher than they were 100 years ago. They're not as high as they could be or should be, but they are higher. Secondly, it created, certainly between, say, 1780 and maybe the closing decades of the 19th century, British economic and technological leadership. 19th century after 1815 is, of course, known as the Pax Britannica, And it was Britain's industrial power and its capabilities of raising economic resources to essentially create this. And finally, it created what is known as the Great Divergence, which is, of course, the divergence between Europe and China, as coined by Kenneth Pomeranz in his famous book, in which essentially Western Europe led the entire world, say between 1880 and maybe 1945 or later on, and then of course American leadership, which is very much indebted to it. And so what this work will do is try to explain why Britain was the leader, or British precocity, so to speak, and what was so special about Britain. So before I do this, maybe a few more words about the Industrial Revolution. We essentially take the position to which we take from other people before us, particularly Paul Mantoux and David Landis, that looks at the Industrial Revolution as a technological event. There are alternatives, and maybe I should briefly mention them. Okay, one of them is, of course, a demographic alternative. Essentially, the Industrial Revolution was sort of the breaking of the Malthusian regime, which kept the world poor by sort of Malthusian logic. There is what you might call an industrial organization interpretation, which is sort of the rise of the factory system. That's not just modern, of course. It goes all the way to Karl Marx, as everybody knows, and then Max Weber and Mantoux himself. Essentially, excuse me, it meant the rising ratio of fixed to circulating capital, as Marx would put it. But it's an orthodox Marxist definition, but other people have signed up to it. And finally, there is sort of the rise of the more, I would say, Polanyi kind of interpretation or history of capitalism, which looks at the growth of importance of formal markets in both goods and factors. When all is said and done, the Industrial Revolution is about technology. As a famous British philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, once said, the Industrial Revolution was the age in which people invented how to invent. That sort of, I think, captures it to a great extent. And they solved the problems that they wanted to solve that were within their reach. Some things were not within their reach, so they couldn't solve them. But they were focused on solving certain problems, and I'll give you some examples of that later on. So here are these focusing devices. In the 18th century, if you looked at what the British were concerned with and what were they trying to do, here are 8 problems that they faced that bugged them. And I see them all. Pumping water out of coal mines is, of course, a really big deal. How to prevent smallpox, how to turn pig iron into wrought iron and steel eventually, how to make ceramics that could compete with ceramics they were bringing from China, Chinaware, how to determine longitude at sea, how to spin yarn, cotton yarn mostly, but other yarns as well, without the use of human fingers, which people had been doing since days immemorial, how to light homes and businesses at night, how to preserve perishable foods. And the fact of the matter is that by 1815, every single one of those 8 problems, and many others, had been solved. Some of them completely, some of them in part, but they were basically online. The only one that still defeated them was making cheap steel. That was to come later. And so the classic Industrial Revolution, we sort of think this is following Thomas Ashton's famous differentiation. The classical Industrial Revolution, essentially 1760 to 1830. Then after that, we get the age of railroads and consolidation. And after 1870, the Second Industrial Revolution. And from there, it spreads, as you know, to the European continent, including parts of France, of course, North America, and then eventually to Eastern Europe, Russia, and Japan, and so on. And so by 1914, and this is really sort of global history in a nutshell, the world had bifurcated into a convergence club of rich industrialized countries and the rest. So why was the Industrial Revolution different? So it's of course not true that before 1750 there was no technological progress. I've written a book about that, and there's a lot of going on in Europe in the Middle Ages and in the Age of Renaissance. But the fact of the matter is that when you see breakthroughs happening before 1750, it always eventually peters out. So, take something like the printing press, which is sort of in many ways a paradigmatic invention. So it's a major breakthrough in 1450, and it gets better between 1450 and the early 16th century. But then the technology sort of asymptotes off to some kind of best practice technique, and it doesn't get much better after that. The same is true for weapons, the same is true for ship design. They improve, and then it sort of peters out. It's kind of an odd thing. The Industrial Revolution was different, and that, I think, makes it a landmark in human history comparable only to the Neolithic Revolution. In a way, the British economy, and eventually other economies, go into some kind of self-reinforcing positive feedback loop. And there is no evidence that this is converging to anything that looks like an equilibrium. Not today, not 10 years ago, not 10 years in the future. In many ways, this is more like, if you want, like a phase transition in physics. I mean, the entire dynamics and the parameters that determine the dynamics have changed. And so the point is that you get a whole bunch of inventions between 1760 and 1830, but they don't fizzle out, and they keep improving. So, here is a whole list of them. I'm not going to go read every single one of them, but essentially steam engines are getting better. Eventually, there's a switch from low-pressure to high-pressure steam engines, which makes, of course, a very big difference. Major improvements in civil engineering. In textile manufacturing, the new ideas that had been first applied to cotton eventually become applied to wool and linen and to other stages of the cotton industry. In metals, new techniques keep appearing even before the great breakthrough of the 1850s and 1860s, which is the manufacturing of cheap steel. And then there's a whole range of technological advances in a range of consumer industry, candles, ceramics, food preservation, cement, printing, and on and on and on. So you can see things keep advancing and no longer enter in some kind of new stationary state. So, of course, it's first the British industrial is a local phenomenon. It's, it's been widely remarked, for instance, that Jane Austen, who lived during the Industrial Revolution, seemingly was unaware of it, because never in any of her novels does she mention anything like it. Now, she lived in the south of England, and much of the action was in the north, but it's still striking, how she was. Now, of course, once you get into Charles Dickens and other people like that, then you can see at least some of the aspects of it. And the main areas that are affected here, you see a map, and you can sort of see where most of the action is. It's in the Midlands, a little bit in South Wales, and in the Scottish lowland. That's where most of the action is. The rest of England, here and there, you see something, but that's where it's concentrated. And the main areas in which technology changed is energy, particularly, of course, steam. But one of the lesser-known facts about the Industrial Revolution is that water power was improved almost pari passu with steam. And had steam never been made operational, there still would have been an Industrial Revolution based on water, as there was in Switzerland, in New England, in Alsace, in France. It was all based on water power. And so to somehow identify the Industrial Revolution with steam is a mistake. Then, of course, there's materials, especially, of course, what happens with iron, but also glass, cement, ceramics, and paper. There's very miscellaneous textiles. And then under 5, I put 3 inventions that are major breakthroughs, but none of them have any big economic effects, okay? One of them is hot air ballooning, of course, done here in France by the Montgolfier brothers, as everybody knows. The marine chronometer, which allows you to determine longitude at sea, which I mentioned earlier, and smallpox vaccination in 1796. So there's some kind of debate among historians to what extent we should think of the Industrial Revolution being concentrated in a few sectors. And our approach is no. Our approach is this is a very wide advance on a multitude of fronts. It's not just cotton, it is not just steam, it is not just iron, it is progress. And progress in areas that people could make progress in. Now, electricity was too hard for them to solve until the late 1860s. But in areas where they could make progress, they made progress. They believed in progress. As I said, there's a change in energy usage. Steam engine is in many ways a quantum leap, epistemologically, because it's, of course, the first time that humans are able to convert thermal energy into kinetic energy. Which is they didn't actually know that. Okay, that's sort of a later interpretation, but it's true. That is an explanation of what engines do. Right? They turn heat into motion. Nobody had ever done that before, and it turned out to be of vast importance to human history. And there's major changes in transportation. And of course, as you get major advances in transportation, the British economy becomes more and more integrated. And integrated means specialization. And as Adam Smith already taught us, specialization adds to the increase in productivity due to technology. Then there is, of course, urbanization. There is, as I mentioned, the rise of factory work, which completely changed the organization of work, and for the first time submitted people on a large scale to what we would call today factory discipline. I always sort of stress to my students how important that is. Before 1750, I would say 98 or 97% of all workers worked for themselves. There's some places where people do get employment in construction and some help in agriculture, but roughly speaking, farmers worked on their own farms. Many people what we call manufacturing were artisans working in their workshops. With the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden, you no longer work for yourself. You work for a boss, and the boss says you have to be there at this time. You have to be there. You have a lunch for 30 minutes or something, and then you stay until that time. And you don't show up drunk, and you don't show up late, and you don't. So there's all these rules, and this is rather unusual for people. Nobody lived under such rules in the past except sailors, and so it's a major change in human life in general. And of course, globalization, if that word is appropriate, the foreign sector throughout the 19th century goes faster than GDP, meaning that more and more of it is exported and imported, pointing to specialization. Okay, so here's the question then. Why was Britain first? And there are many explanations. I'm going to go briefly over some of the main highlights of the literature, and then I'm going to come to the main point, which is to come up with our own argument, which we think is different. It's not entirely novel, because nothing is novel in this huge interest, but I think the emphasis and the evidence are a major addition to the literature. So there's no, of course, consensus why the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe rather than in Asia. Why didn't it happen in the Muslim Middle East or in China? But I think that's a separate question of why it happened first in Britain and not in Germany or in France or in Spain. And so it's Britain's precocity in this case that concerns me, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And so the main distinction that I think describes the literature is the sort of maps versus chaps. Maps is geographical argument, and it basically is Britain is blessed with minerals. It has coal and iron. It also has copper. It has fire clay. And it's geographically, it's kind of nice because it's an island. And it's sort of hard to invade. Now, William the Conqueror did it in 1066. But ever since then, really, nobody really succeeded. I mean, Napoleon and Louis XIV both would have liked to try, so did Adolf Hitler, but nobody did it successfully. William the Third doesn't count because he was actually called in by the British. Now, whether it's actually be all that good to be an island as opposed to being part of a continent remains to be seen. I always remind my audience that it was great for Britain to be an island, but for Ireland, which is next door, it didn't do all that well. And so maybe it's good to be an island when there isn't a bigger island right next door like it was true in the British Isles. But even in the Far East, you know, maybe it was a good thing for Japan, but it hasn't done very much for the Philippines. So, I mean, it's an open question. But I would say the issue of coal, or what I call the carbonocentric school, associated with people like Tony Wrigley, has become a major theme in the literature. The alternative is chaps, and particular, of course, institutional school. So one argument that has been extremely influential is that the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was basically a major transition. That is due to a famous paper by Douglas North and Barry Weingast published in 1989, and there's a whole literature that came after that. And essentially, this is something that political scientists and people who think about politics really like. And so Avner Greif, my friend and co-author, basically pointed out that what the 1688 Glorious Revolution meant was what he called coercion constraining institutions. So basically the king in England, certainly from 1689 on, is seriously constrained by the power of Parliament, because the king now knows that Parliament can eventually throw him out if it gets to be bad. And so what it also means is that parliamentary rule was a rule of strong property rights, as Douglas North, of course, really liked, a good governance, and investment in infrastructure. So essentially, good institutions. Moreover, Britain has a few specific institutions, not just Parliament, but more specific ones that nobody else has, that may play or may have played a role. And here's just 3 of them, or 4 of them. One is that Britain has a poor law. The poor law dates from late Elizabethan times, and it's been essentially implemented everywhere in the country. It is the only country in the world where it is effectively illegal to starve. That if you are on the verge of starvation, the local community or the local poor law governors are supposed to support you. And in fact, we see that starvation in Britain never comes back. There are good years and bad years. There is no starvation in Britain. And the poor law did all kinds of other things that people have thought were important for its growth. Then there is intellectual property rights, IPRs. Britain has a patent system. So does the Netherlands, but nobody else really has anything like it. France has a very different system that works quite differently. But Britain, from 1624 on, has a patent system. And clearly, we can see in the patent statistics, you can see the Industrial Revolution, because if you look at the patent statistics, I didn't have reproduced the graph here, but it looks like this, here. It's more or less static until 1750. And in 1750, all of a sudden, you see the patents going up. And that tells you something, that, these intellectual property rights may have mattered. Britain has relatively weak guilds. It does have wilks and other corporations, but compared to the continent, they really do very little. They organize parties, they spend a lot of time drinking, but their political influence by that time has been minimized. And finally, Britain has a fairly reasonably rational taxation system. Now, I hasten to emphasize, it has high taxes. It's one of the most heavily taxed countries in Europe, but it has a tax system that, certainly by the standards of the time, was rational and made sense. There are no internal tariff barriers. Unlike France, unlike Spain, unlike Germany, everywhere you move stuff around, you have to pay tariffs. In England, there are no internal tariff barriers. What's more, the taxes are almost all levied on either imports, which economists don't like, but that's a source of revenue, or excise taxes. So in Britain, almost everything is taxed. Candles and bricks and beer and you name it, which is great for economic historians because they left us records so we can actually estimate how many bricks were produced in Britain, and that's a nice index for construction. But there was no tax on bread. That's very smart, because a tax on bread typically is a bad idea because it's extremely regressive, obviously, and it usually causes riots. There are riots, there are tax riots here in France, there are bread riots in the Netherlands. There are very few bread riots in England because it's not taxed. So that makes, I think, a big difference. Then there's a few other schools which I will deal with briefly. There's the imperialist school that basically says, oh, what really was so successful for Britain was the slave trade, slavery, and the Atlantic economy. So there's a whole literature here, the most famous of which I didn't mention here. This is Williams's famous book came out in 1944 about how slavery drove the Industrial Revolution. It's sort of hard for an economist to buy into. There's no slavery in Britain, so you'd have to really focus on the Caribbean. And if it's the Caribbean you're talking about, then you ran into all kinds of problems, which is why didn't France, which had the most profitable colony in Saint-Dominique, which is now Haiti, of course, until the rebellion. So it's sort of hard to buy this argument. But this is popular in history departments, particularly the sort of people who do history of capitalism thing. Well, then there is a so-called contingency school, which I think is a little bit of a joke, in which is sort of a paper that Nick Crafts wrote in 1977, basically saying something like, well, Britain was just lucky. If Nelson had lost at Trafalgar, France would have been overtaken. Francois actually argued that. Not so sure. And then there is an argument that was proposed maybe by now, almost 20 years ago, by Bob Allen, who is a trained economist, which basically argued that the main thing that drove Britain is high wages and cheap coal. And so what that really means, if the wages are high and the coal is cheap, then there's an incentive to invent in a direction that's labor saving, because labor is expensive. You're trying to save it and replace it with coal. And it became very popular, it became a hit among economists, and then we all started to take a closer look at it, and I think today it's maybe not quite the consensus. Then there is more recent suggestions. There is, this is sort of part of my own work. It's sort of the argument that the 18th century witnessed the Enlightenment. It's a theme that I've written a big book about, and I'm going to mention it today. But maybe put it this way. It was always argued by English historians that England had an industrial revolution and France didn't. And French historians always argued that France had an Enlightenment and England did not. And neither of these statements are actually completely correct. Britain had an Enlightenment. It was a very different Enlightenment than France did because the problems were different. So in Britain, they were less thinking about the relationship between the king and the people, between human rights, between laws, and between social contracts and the kind of things that French Enlightenment philosophers were writing about. In Britain, they're more pragmatic and more practical. How to solve problems of the ones that I mentioned before. But it is an Enlightenment because it is based on the fundamental belief that we can work to make things better. Okay? Now there's another sort of related but slightly different way of looking at this. Is my friend Deirdre McCloskey's famous trilogy called about bourgeois virtues, which is 2,000 pages, because 3 volumes, which I have summarized and in one sentence, which is, I think, something were feet. Free innovation led by the bourgeoisie became at long last respectable. Okay, so that's, I think, the summary. Now you don't have to spend, the whole summer reading these 2,000 pages. Then there is a very nice French cognitive scientist called Nicolas Baumard, which published a wonderful article in 2018, in which he basically pointed out that on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, Britain already had higher income, coupled to somewhat lower inequality, although it was still a highly unequal society, of course. And that basically led to what he called life history theory, which is something that I learned from him and then looked it up in the cognitive science literature. And it's quite something true, which is that people grow up in richer households behave different than people who grow up in really, really poor households. And they tend to be, on the whole, more entrepreneurial, more innovative, more willing to take risk, more cooperative with others, all kind of characteristics that you might associate with the kind of things that may bring about an industrial revolution. I think that's actually an important in view. So this is, come back for a second to Bob Allen's book. This is his book, and it was, it sold very well. He's a great guy, but so this is the argument that I just made, and essentially what he argued was that labor-saving inventions, such as the spinning jenny and the puddling wrought iron progress, constituted the heart of the Industrial Revolution, and this is sort of consistent with a whole bunch of theoretical papers by Daron Acemoglu and others who looked at endogenous technological change being directed by factor prices. That's sort of the idea. So this has come under heavy criticism. I'm not actually going to go through all the data, all the criticism here. There's no good explanation, by the way, why British wages were so high. But here's one little piece of evidence that I wanted to tell you about, because it's sort of a fun thing. This is actually the fundamental flaw in Allen's argument that was pointed out 2 centuries before this paper on this matter. Of course, what matters is not wages, but unit labor costs. So wages only matter if workers are, roughly speaking, equally productive across space. But if it were to be the case that every British worker was, say, 50% more efficient than every French worker, and the British worker earned a wage that was 50% higher, unit labor cost would be exactly the same. Now, this was not a modern insight. Here is a quotation from Arthur Young writing in 1790. And you can sort of see that this is sort of still the funny sort of print of the late 18th century. But here's what he says. He says, the vast superiority of English manufacture, taking the growth to those of France, united with the higher price of labor, is a subject of great political curiosity and importance, for it shows clearly that it is not the nominal cheapness of labor that favors manufacture, which flourish most when labor is nominally the dearest. Perhaps they flourish on discount, he says, since labor is in generally the cheapest where it is nominally the dearest. In other words, Britain pays higher wages, but labor is relatively cheap. Why? The quality of the work, the skill and dexterity of performance come largely into the account, and these must, on average, depend very much on the state of ease in which the workman lives. In other words, overall living standards produces more productive workers, and more productive workers will get paid more. That is not going to be a reason for you to substitute labor for fuel. Well, there's a good reason to believe that British workers were, on average, more productive than French workers. We noticed that they were, on the whole, physically stronger and, something we can measure very well, taller. And that's sort of the paper that we did in 2014 points this out. British workers were taller, better fed, stronger, and better managed and trained, which is something I'll come back to. And so that basically says that higher wages are the consequence of higher productivity, not a cause. And so now, that does not fully explain the Industrial Revolution, in my view, for the following reason. I think what you see in the Industrial Revolution is a process that's pushed ahead not by the whole labor force, but by maybe 2 or 3% of the very top workers. These are the people who make the inventions, who implement them, and so on and so forth. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's basically, maybe my estimate would be something like 2 or 3% of the labor force. I call this, and that's what this funny thing is here at the bottom, upper tail human capital. You can think of the human capital distribution of a society of looking like, some normal distribution or something like that. And you look at the people who are the very best, the most talented, the most trained, the most dexterous, and so on and so forth. That, I think, is what matters. So the fact that the average British worker may have been more productive than the French worker may not be, at first glance, be relevant. And so that, I think, is a fundamental point, and I want to stress it. Upper tail human capital is the skilled elite artisans, engineers, mechanics, applied mathematicians, coal viewers, all kind of people like that. This is not a new idea, ladies and gentlemen. Here is David Hume writing in 1742. Okay, those who cultivate the sciences at any stage are always few in number. And then Adam Smith agrees, to think of, or to, not an accident, of course, because the two are close friends, to think or to reason comes to be, like every employment, a particular business which is carried on by very few people who furnish the public with the thought and reason possessed by the vast multitudes that labor. Okay, so this is essentially the idea that it's a small group of top people who drive progress. Is this still true today? Well, you tell me. So here is what we are going to propose. So one way of looking at economic history, and this is probably going to be controversial, I don't know, is that the dynamics of history are driven by feedback loops. That's to say, something happens that drives something else, and that something else then feeds back into the original thing. So much of the economic history of before 1600 is characterized by what we call negative feedback loops. And here are two negative feedback loops. Any kind of economic growth basically in the end ends up negating itself. So the classic example is, of course, Malthusian dynamics, right? So there you have the briefest representation of the Malthusian models I can imagine. So any kind of positive productivity shock leads to rising income, right? Rising incomes leads to rising birth rates and falling death rates. These lead to population growth. Population growth leads to diminishing returns because the land is fixed and the income declines. Okay, so rising incomes leads to declining incomes. That's a classic negative feedback loop. Here's another one, political dynamics. Positive productivity shock leads to rising incomes. That leads to increased local rent seeking by people who want to, grab the surplus, or more common maybe, poorer predatory neighboring states invading. That leads to higher taxes. It leads to war-related change. Eventually, there are worse incentives and declining incomes. That's basically what happens to the country of my birth, the Netherlands, between, say, 1600 and 1800. Okay? They got very rich, and then all these other nations, Spain and France and England, and eventually even Prussia, tried to invade and grab their riches. Some of it was successful, a lot of it was not, because they had this trick of flooding the country. But it did end economic growth. But there are also positive feedback loops. And they are driving what is known as Matthew effects. Okay, so there is a quote from Matthew. For everyone who has more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. In other words, the rich get richer and the poor get poor, okay? And so that's a positive feedback loop, and I'll give you some examples. But basically, you can think of history as sort of a horse race between negative and positive feedback loops. And what the Industrial Revolution is the triumph of positive feedback loops over negative feedback loops. The Malthusian model doesn't exist anymore, of course, and hopefully, this predatory behavior will not recur, although there are days when I'm not so sure about that. And so what kind of positive feedback loops can we identify? Well, there is, as I mentioned already, Baumard's life history argument, which says basically rising income means that children grow up in richer families. That leads to more entrepreneurship and more willingness to take risks, more cooperative behavior, more trusting, even more rising incomes, and so on and so forth. Secondly, and this is more standard among development economists and biologists, low income leads to malnutrition. Malnutrition in the early stages of life leads to both cognitive and physiological stunting. That leads, of course, to lower income, and so you get into the poverty trip. You reverse that, of course. Higher income precisely reverses this. And so now, clearly, this is limited in some sense. You know, as income goes higher and higher, cognitive ability will eventually level off. You know, I don't think that people, the sons of billionaires, have an IQ of 400. That's not going to happen. But within a certain range, it does count. And finally, and this is something that I think is actually probably underrated, if you have rising incomes, people will buy high income elasticity goods, so what we call luxury goods. And so what kind of luxury goods do we want? Well, things that require a high level of accuracy and precision in manufacturing. So musical instruments, and believe it or not, telescopes. People bought telescopes because, you know, there wasn't any television to watch, so they took a telescope and they were looking at the sky. That's what counted for entertainment in the 18th century. Upmarket furniture, high quality furniture, paintings, things like that. And these all require higher skills. And so investment in human capital, and from there rising productivity and rising income. So these are just three examples of the kind of positive feedback loops that I like. But now I'm going to propose an additional positive feedback, which is that higher income leads to fewer people at a subsistence level of income, meaning, of course, you know, all other things equal, more intellectuals, more people who read books, more people who know mathematics and science and so forth. And so more upper tail human capital, people who can spend time thinking about useful knowledge. And that will lead eventually to more technological progress, higher productivity, higher incomes, okay? And so the argument is that by 1700 or so, Britain was already a relatively rich country that succeeded in raising income levels beyond subsistence. And instead of the negative feedback loop that was supposed to jump in, eventually it did not kick in. And the Malthusian model by that time probably doesn't hold for England at all. A few tried to invade, but didn't succeed, and voila. So there you have it. So that's just what I just said. And also important, internal rent-seeking is somewhat curbed, not quite, you know, ended, by the power of Parliament that constrained the king from overtaxing everybody. And eventually, of course, by an Enlightenment mentality that objected to what they call corruption. So how come Britain is already rich in 1700? You have to explain that. Well, there's no fighting on British soil since 1649, since the end of the Civil War. Okay, that's a hell of a lot more than you can say about almost every place on the continent that I can think of. Secondly, integrated market, I already mentioned that. And there is profits from the Atlantic trade, no question about it. We know where they are. And above all, and this tends to be underplayed, a very highly productive agricultural sector. And of course, an agricultural sector is the one that produces food. And if people are better fed, you can exactly jump into that positive feedback loop I talked about earlier. So here's some data. This is growth rates of real GDP population and real GDP per capita. And you can sort of see right there, I put a red circle around it, that the decade, sort of the half century second half century of the 17th century is one of very high rising GDP per capita. Later on, it slows down a little bit, but I think that is those are the years that really counted. And so, so this is just to show you that in the same period, total factor productivity, it's the last column, you've got to sort of see with the round circle around it, 0.49. I mean, by today's standards, that's not overwhelming, but trust me, for something like the 17th century, that is a quite amazing thing. And in fact, this is sort of being confirmed by more recent work using somewhat different techniques by three economists who've shown, whose paper sort of, I think is titled as Growth Began in 1600. I think it's probably more like 1640s, but those are details we can argue about. And a lot of this is agriculture. So you look at agriculture, labor productivity in agriculture, and you can actually see that it's particularly the first half of the 18th century where labor productivity in agriculture is particularly rapidly growing. So we more or less know why that is so. We know what the improvements in agriculture were. I mean, if I told you about it, you'd all fall asleep, so I'm not going to talk about it. But trust me, this is the net result. Okay? And yet, here is something that I want to emphasize. And that is, this growth was mostly driven by Smithian processes. That is to say, better allocation of resources, more specialization, gains from trade, things that we all know. The notion that it is about innovation as such, that comes later. And the question is, what drives that? And so here I want to talk about artisanal upper tail human capital. And that is going to be the crux of my argument, okay? And so think about technological change. Technological change can happen, as it did for most of history, what we call bottom-up. So you have thousands and thousands of artisans who try to make something, I don't know what, shoes or furniture or whatever, and eventually they improve things and hopefully others copy them, and so productivity goes up. Or you can have technological change that happens top-down. A small number of inventors, some of them famous, most of them not so famous, but we know who they are, and a larger but still small number of people who make improvements and adjustments. That we call them tweakers, in the sense that they tweak the invention rather than actually make the big thing, but they make it better and better and increase productivity. And so the crucial argument about the Industrial Revolution is this. Much of the progress was generated by relatively few people. Not the 5 or 6 names that Victorian hagiographers would write their biographies about, but as I said, maybe 2 or 3% of the labor force, which is still a fairly large number. So who were these people? Well, some of them were intellectuals. They called themselves natural philosophers, that is to say, scientists, okay? And they tried to take insights from chemistry, physics, applied mathematics, botany, and so on and so forth, to try to make production better. Some of them were entrepreneurs, clever businessmen. Some of them were sort of inventors who just basically were thinking outside the box, trying to do something new, even though they may not have been very well educated, but they were very good with their hands. A few were, by the way, physicians, applied mathematicians, architects, surveyors, people like that. And then you have these sort of untrained tinkerers, the people who are just playing with things and hit upon some kind of an idea. But the critical thing is not so much the inventors themselves. It's the engineers, the clockmakers, the ironmongers, and so on and so forth, that had what I call competence. Not necessarily great original thinkers, but people who could actually make things. And so here is an interesting riddle. Why did James Watt succeed where Leonardo da Vinci failed? Leonardo da Vinci, we know, invented hundreds of things, really clever things, and yet none of them were built in his age. James Watt, made a fair number of inventions, all of which were implemented in his time. Why was that? So that, I think, is critical. So here I'm going to expose you to one of the worst poems ever written by me. So why did none of Leonardo's inventions ever become a reality, but James Watt did, okay? So this is a really bad poem, okay? So don't judge me. But here it is. The difference between Leonardo and Watt was that Watt had Wilkinson and Leonardo did not. Terrible. But here is John Wilkinson. John Wilkinson, not as famous as Watt, but still quite well known, was an ironmonger who invented a boring machine that could bore cylinders at a much higher degree of accuracy or lower tolerance than anything before. And if you're going to build a steam engine, that's what you need. If the cylinder leaks, it ain't going to work. And so that's the kind of person that was around in Britain at the time. So there you have him. These were his years. He was painted by Gainsborough. Probably he wasn't wearing these clothes in his works, but he was. And there were hundreds of people like this in England. Not millions, but hundreds. And that is what was needed. So when somebody, you invent something, you add something to what Philippe called prescriptive knowledge, right? Somebody has to execute the blueprint or the model of the invention. Not once, but over and over and over again. Scale it up, operate it, maintain it, repair the machinery, make it operate under a variety of circumstances. That is where the real test comes. And then, of course, they also improve things. So these are tweakers and implementers. I wrote a paper about that a while ago. But this is what you really need. So you need the great inventors, the guys like James Watt and John Smeaton and so on and so forth. But you need people who can carry out their work. If you don't have that, you're not going to have an industrial revolution. And so this is, I think, the key difference between Britain and other continental countries. And actually, James Watt said this much. He said, the principal hindrance to erecting engines is always the smith's work. The people who actually do that with their hands, okay? So he had a bunch of people listed here who worked for him. We know who they were. We know how skilled they were, particularly the guy William Murdoch, and of course John Wilkinson, and so on and so forth. And so can a larger endowment of skilled artisans explain British precocity? I'm going to skip this because I'm starting to run out of time. But I do need to sort of put some empirical evidence behind this statement that Britain had more and better artisans than anybody else, okay? And the evidence is going to come in 4 different parts. The first is, people at the time said so. So here's a name that France should be very proud of. This is Jean-Baptiste Say, one of the great economists of his time, maybe the leading student of Adam Smith everywhere, not just in France. And here's what he says. This is in his 1803 book. He says, Britain's wealth was due to the wonderful practical skills of her, he calls it, the translation says adventurers, but that's really entrepreneurs, in the useful application of knowledge and the superiority of her workmen. Okay? Here's another guy, this is an engineer, lived a little bit later, and he basically wrote an important treatise, and he says the prevailing talent of English and Scotch people is to apply new ideas to use, but they do not imagine as much as foreigners. I don't know if that's true or not, but clearly that's where the advantage that Britain had is not so much in the new ideas as such, but in carrying them out and implementing them. That's what Ferry says. Now, to make this a causal factor, of course, you have to show that the difference was already there before the Industrial Revolution. So here you got Daniel Defoe writing 1726, before the Industrial Revolution. The English are justly famed for improving arts rather than inventing. Well, I actually think that's not clear, but there you have it. And below that, and this is a very famous quote this is a Swiss guy who visited Britain and remarked in 1706, for a thing to be perfect, he says, it has to be invented in France and worked out in England. you know, it's just one man saying it, but I think it's been cited over and over again, and all these other people cited just as much. And the French, of course, were pretty much aware of this gap. So in 1780s, there's a brief episode of peace between England and France. It didn't last very long. It was between 1783 and 1793. But in between, they signed something called the Eden Commercial Treaty, which lowered French tariffs on British goods. And one French author said, you know, look, we have to compete now with England because we have no more tariff protection. What do? Well, we have set the French workmen to grips with the English workmen. It is the combat of a naked man against an armed man. And it has the outcome we, Collège, expect, and the victory cannot be disputed. Is no resource left to us. Well, there you have it. Now, it's of course true that a whole bunch of British inventors put to rest the notion that Britain did have no creativity to invent things. But yet, I think the argument is that Britain may have an absolute advantage in both, but a comparative advantage in improvement. So here you have one tabulation of major inventions made at the time, all the way to now. And you can sort of see that in no period does Britain have the majority of invention. France is always there, and together France and Germany and other countries, Scandinavia, the Netherlands and so on, are still making a lot of inventions. So they're good at inventing, but they're not the only one. But what they're better at is implementing and improving it. So here's the second piece of evidence. You can see knowledge flows can be inferred. Superiority can be inferred from knowledge flows. Britain was the first country to implement many inventions made elsewhere. And so among them are some of the greatest French inventions. So mechanical linen spinning, of course, chlorine bleaching, both French inventions, soda making, food canning, the jacquard loom, paper making machinery, all of them first invented in France. The voltaic pile, invented in Italy. Telegraph, which came from Denmark. In all of those, we know the inventions were made elsewhere, and the Britain said, we'll be glad to implement it for you. So, for instance, something like mechanical linen spinning, even though it was invented here in France, was first fully carried out in Leeds in Yorkshire. All of those were introduced first in Britain with commercial success, more or less. And moreover, a whole bunch of French efforts were spent on spying on Britain or trying to smuggle out equipment and ideas. Moreover, some very famous cases of continental inventors who came up with a good idea, couldn't have it built in their countries, traveled to England and says, I'm going to find people who can build my invention. So of those, there's a man called Aimé Argan, who was from Geneva, Swiss. He invented a very important piece of equipment called the Argan lamp in about 1786. There you have it. That's the Argan lamp. You can sort of see this is. So if you went camping in the 1950s and 60s, you might still have one of those. You sort of lit it. It's a wick coming out of oil, and it was a major hit. Sorry, let me go back to this for a minute. He went to England to have it built because it couldn't get built anywhere on the continent, and he thought he was going to make it rich. And so they built it. It was a great success, but they cheated him. And he went back to the continent very angry. But this technological invention was implemented in Britain. Here's another one. This is Friedrich Koenig, a German, a Saxon inventor, made a major set of improvements to the printing press, including using a steam-powered, high-speed printing press. He had to come to England to have it built. And he lived in London from 1806 to 1817, and that's where this printing press was first implemented. Then eventually, of course, it was introduced in Germany as well. There you have his press. So you can sort of see that he too had to come to England to have this worked out. The third piece of evidence is what I call sort of policy evidence. And that is that Britain actually realizes that it has this advantage in artisans, but thinking still like mercantilists, they say, well, we've got to keep those people at home. We can't let them go outside. So there are laws in Britain that prohibit the immigration of artisans. Now, this is the late 18th and 19th century. It's sort of hard to enforce. You can legislate anything you want. You know, enforcing it is another matter. And so, but certainly in the early 1780s, no skilled artisan in manufacturing was legally free to leave Britain or Ireland and enter any foreign country. You know, I can give you a long list of people who violated these rules, but it was on the books, meaning that somebody thought, gee, we should prevent these people staying because our artisans are better than theirs. That's basically the argument. And so that's what I just said. So here is, however, the smoking gun of the argument. To transfer the tacit knowledge of making these new machinery work, you had to have people migrating, showing people, because it's, you know, it's not stuff that you can write in books. It's stuff that's tacit. That's the stuff I skipped. And the continent imported English and Scottish engineers and skilled manufacture on a huge scale, and needed them because they could import the machinery. Certainly after 1815, they could not maintain it, they could not operate it, and they could not repair it when it broke down, which happened all the time, by the way. And so this is even happening in the 18th century. We know that there's a clockmaker called Henry Sully, who founded the Société des Arts in Paris in 1720. There's a John Holker, a famous story about an Englishman who actually fled because he was a Jacobite, meaning essentially supporter of the Stuarts. And he actually became Inspecteur de Manufacture in France, and on and on. So this was already happening before the revolution and during the Ancien Régime. After 1815, basically the floodgates opened. And we know that certainly by the early 1820s, the number of people estimated to be is maybe somewhere around 20,000. Okay, there's a Frenchman called Fabrice Ben-Simon who wrote a magnificent book about this that we are relying on it. But it isn't just in France. It is everywhere. Belgium, Germany, and Habsburg, you know. If you look, I wrote a book in my younger days about the Industrial Revolution in the Low Countries, in Belgium and the Netherlands. You know, the people who ran the factories had names like Thomas Ainsworth, John Hudson, and William Cockerell. I mean, these were all Brits who came to the Low Countries to teach the natives how to use this new equipment. This is a very famous example, a little bit later, but it's kind of a good one. This is a man called John Hughes. It was Welsh, actually, who founded a place in Russia, in what is now known as the Donetsk. The city was called Yuzovka, named after him. Yuzovska, you get it, it's named after Hughes, in eastern Ukraine, which is now under Russian occupation. And if you go to the city of Donetsk, I recommend against, by the way, but that's a different matter. But if you go there, you can see this statue of John Hughes, who brought 200 or 300 Welsh iron workers with him. The place was very well endowed with both iron and coal, but not skills, Russians. And so they built it, and it's still there. The city, by the way, changed its name later on to Stalino, I guess after whom that was named, and now it's called the city of Donetsk. But it was known as Yuzovka for many years. So here's some of the argument, okay? British leadership in the Industrial Revolution is rooted in an artisanal elite who had the technical competence not just to invent, but to design and build and operate and maintain and scale up continuously the new machinery that was coming online. And if you did not have these people, particularly the great inventors named, you know, Arkwright and Watt and so many others would have come up with inventions, and they would have gone down history just like Leonardo's did in the 15th century. And I think that is the kind of story that explains why Britain was different from everybody else. So there's two more questions. And I'm not going to be able to go through all of this because time is running out. But the first question is there systematic data that you could use to prove this? And then the bigger question is, all right, so you convinced me that these artisans were better and they do, but how come? So I'll be brief about number one and a little bit longer about number two. So we tested the skills hypothesis on British data. And I'm not going to take you through the fine details of the econometrics here, because you can find this in our paper that we published a few years ago in the Journal of Political Economy. But we were able to actually find data about the presence of high-skilled mechanics in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution in a retrospective census of 1831. And so the details for that I'm going to skip. But here you can see the connection between mechanics and tool makers here in the 1790s, early on, and the industrial employment 40 years later. And, it's not perfect. If it were perfect, you wouldn't believe me anyway. But I think it is statistically significant and important. Here's another one. This is looking at textile employment in 1851. And you can see that the relationship still holds. Well, here's a bunch of tables which I'm going to skip because it's technical stuff. But one thing that is actually interesting is this allowed us to actually try to estimate the size of this group of people, of these high-skilled mechanics, and people like that. And so here's a bit of technical detail, but the bottom line is that we're looking at somewhere between 2 and 2.5% of the adult male labor force in industry. Okay, so that, I think, is a fair way of looking at what part of the distribution we should consider to be upper tail human capital. And then finally, and I'll try to be brief here, how come British superiority? Where does it come from? And that's something which I, of course, spent a great deal thinking about and worrying about. And essentially, the story is, there's two stories. I'll be brief about the first one and a little longer about the second one. The first is that, and I'm relying here on work by the great technological historian Nathan Rosenberg, who came up with this idea of sort of focusing devices. And he points out that there are certain industries and certain projects that actually create skills. And so the biggest one is maybe coal mining. So I don't actually think that coal was such a critical part of the Industrial Revolution as a source of heat or power. But coal mining requires a great deal of skills all along. First finding the coal, then digging the shafts, and then pulling it out. And, and then transporting it to where it's needed and using it correctly. So having coal actually sharpened British skills. The same is true for shipbuilding. Britain was, of course, a very maritime nation. And, of course, building ships and navigating them requires a great deal of skills. And, of course, it requires instruments so you can know where you are. And there is an important industry, much more important in Britain maybe than almost anywhere else, which is clock and watchmaking, which, by the way, owed a great deal to Louis XIV, who kicked out the Huguenots in 1685, many of whom migrated to England and started a clock and watchmaking industry. So, but that's a different story. And then there's a story about millwrights. Building mills, too, required a great deal of skills, both in woodworking and in ironworking, so I have a paper about that. So many of the identifiable engineers and skilled technicians came from these sectors. Part of it is, and I mentioned this already, was on the demand side. So because Britain has a large middle class, they demanded these high-skill goods. Here's a whole list of them: clocks, watches, musical instruments, telescopes, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, creates the demand for people to acquire these skills. But the big story comes not from the demand side, but from the supply side. And here is a fundamental fact of skill transmission in pre-industrial revolution Europe. and that is there are no schools where you can learn to be a mechanic or an engineer or any kind of highly technical skilled worker. The only way to acquire these skills is apprenticeship. It's a personal relationship between a master and an apprentice. It's a contractual relationship. Usually the parents or the guardians of the apprentice sign a contract. Sometimes it's written, sometimes it's implicit, but there's a contract between, basically saying, look, I'm going to teach this kid to become a baker or something like that, and in return you will pay me so and so much cash, sometimes, not always, and he will work for me, do what I tell him, and then after he's an accomplished baker, he will work for me at low wages for another year or two to pay me for my effort of teaching him. Roughly speaking, that's the nature of the contract. And so the quality of the market for apprentices is critical to the supply of skills. And here's the thing. In much of the continent, the entire institution of apprenticeship is still regulated by the guilds. And so guilds control it, they specify, they oversee it, and all that. In Britain, it has become a market. The market for apprenticeship, essentially saying, with some limitations, that anybody can do whatever they want. You can study with whoever you want, if you can afford it, if the guy will take you, and there's essentially no constraint. It is true, of course, there's a famous statute in England in 1563, which is called the Statute of Artificers, that supposedly regulated the institution. But like so many of these statutes, it's basically a dead letter. Nobody paid any attention to it, and nobody bothered to put anybody in jail or find anybody who violated it. So, for instance, the statute of apprenticeships, of artificers, says that the standard length of an apprenticeship is 7 years. We looked at data, you can look anywhere. Sometimes people stay 2 or 3 years, sometimes they stay 10 years, 12 years. It takes more time to learn to be a clockmaker than to be a baker. It's kind of obvious if you think about that. So it is a market. And so there's very important work by Patrick Wallace, who just wrote a big book about it, and others, showing that this is a market. It was far more effective than it was on the continent. And it's important here to emphasize the economics. And I want to spend 3 minutes on the economics of this contract, because it's really critical to understand this. The apprenticeship contract is an extremely complex transaction. Essentially, it's a non-repeated interaction between two parties that suffer from asymmetric information, right? So the master knows what to be taught, but the apprentice doesn't know this, nor do his guardians, okay? There are strong incentives for both sides to cheat and to behave opportunistically, right? It is, if you want to call it, the mother of all incomplete contracts. Okay, you can't possibly write everything in the contract, because if you wrote everything in the contract, you'd have to specify that the apprentice to a baker would have to learn to knead the dough and how long to put it in the oven and so on and so forth, and the contract would become infinitely long and would be meaningless. So it is basically based on willingness to cooperate for both sides, and enforcing that contract, therefore, is part of pro-social behavior, if you want. So as I said, in Europe, the continent, much of this was still enforced by guilds. In Britain, less and less so. I don't want to say the guilds had no play at all. There's always examples, but it became absolutely third order. And as I said, so the guilds had lost much of their power, and the contracts became, in fact, self-enforcing. It became self-enforcing because of reputation effects. And that really matters. So if you were a master who took on apprentices and didn't teach them properly, as happened often, and beat them, which happened even more often, this is the 17th and 18th century, then you'd get a reputation of so-and-so treats his apprentices badly. He's not a gentleman. If you weren't a gentleman, you may have lost customers, you may not get credit, you may become socially ostracized. You may not get invited to people's bar mitzvahs. There could be, a serious consequences on the social level. And so the way it worked is essentially everybody, both the master and the apprentices, cared about their reputation because their reputation was valuable. And if there was a dispute between them that couldn't be settled, typically in Britain, you could go to court. You could go to a local magistrate or a justice of peace. People didn't do it very often because going to court was expensive and risky, but you knew that that possibility existed, and that made arbitration relatively easier. So what you really have is what I call a civil economy. You have a civil economy and a civil society in which people try not to behave opportunistically, not the master and not the apprentice. And so, you know, the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you're a historian and you go into the archives, what do you see? You see court records. Who goes to court? Well, the ones that failed this rule, they show up in court, so we know about them. But the vast majority of them were successful, and so there's no record, there's no data. We just know the outcome from aggregate data. So it's a bit frustrating to do this, and people often write about these court cases, but they were exceptional. They were not the rule. And so for both the master and the apprentice in Britain, by and large, the best strategy is to cooperate. For the master to teach it properly and to treat the apprentice well, and for the pupil to fulfill his tasks, not to misbehave and not to abscond if he's supposed to stay after the training was over. And the effects, of course, is a labor force that is well trained, that is taught to be flexible, because you can actually train with 2 or more masters. People did. And it is what stood Britain in very good service in providing the kind of technical competence that I've been talking about for the last hour and a half. That is what I suggest to you made the big difference between Britain and the rest of Europe, at least until the French Revolution, which of course got rid of the guilds and changed everything. So, in sum then, I would say Britain had a major advantage on other nations, not because it had better science, because it didn't. You know, Britain did not have a Laplace or a Lavoisier or a Cournot or on and on and on. Nor because it had more inventors, although it probably did. But that wasn't the reason. But because it had better craftsmen, better artisans, better mechanics who can build the damn things, and everybody wanted them. And it was better craftsmen because it was better at supplying them. And here is one piece of evidence that I've left for. And so what the story I've been telling you implies is that in the long run, the supply of highly skilled labor is elastic and responsive to technological shocks. So I wrote a paper about that in 2017. But the most simple and most obvious proof of it is the absence of any rise in what is called as the skill premium. So the skill premium is the difference in earning between a highly skilled worker and an unskilled worker. And if you think that the new machinery requires more skills and the system has difficulty supplying them, you'd expect the skill premium to go up during the Industrial Revolution. Well, here you have the skill premium from 1700 till 1900. And, there's a brief jump here and there. But by and large, I think you can see the trend in this data is going down. There is no evidence of any long-run rise in skill premium. In fact, the brief rises in it maybe send a signal that, wow, skilled people earn more, so more people run to the best masters. And, of course, that is what brings the skill premium down again. So there is no evidence for this anywhere. And that is what you would have expected to happen. All right, so 2 minutes epilogue. So I would say in the second half of the 18th century, many technological advances, I don't know, most, were still made by clever engineers, not much depended on science yet. I mean, there are counterexamples, particularly here in France with, Claude Berthollet inventing chlorine bleaching and so on. But by and large, I think science played at least a secondary role in the Industrial Revolution. But over time, as you move on into the second half of the 18th century and the first of the 19th century, science became more and more important, in part because the invention of chemistry, so to speak, by Lavoisier and his students, but also major advances in mechanics and other things. Many of them, of course, made here in France by people in the Polytechnique and other places like that. And so the low-hanging fruits of tinkering, which is people who are just good with their hands without any scientific knowledge, had been picked. And more do you depend on formal science and formal mathematics in the advances in engineering and technology. Now, Britain had no advantage, as I keep saying, in scientific and intellectual upper-tier human capital. It was all working people. It was all engineers. And so, so Britain was a borrower of this French knowledge. For instance, Lavoisier's Éléments saw 4 English translations between 1790 and 1799. They knew that this wasn't their forte, and so they would translate books from French. But what this means, I think, is that the reason why the British leadership is in the end ephemeral and temporary and cannot last is because as knowledge becomes more and more codified, more and more normal and science-based, continental countries become increasingly competitive with Britain in things like chemicals, electricity, food processing, eventually even energy. And so all these countries eventually surpass Britain, and Britain becomes what it is today. And so, you know, I can go on about this, but maybe it's time to sort of come to an end. But, you know, you can see how the French are writing sort of the scientific aspects of machines. So this is a book written by a man called Betancourt. It's a program. You can all read this, of course, better than I can. But this is a formalization of what British engineers were doing, turned into mathematical notation and formal graphs. This is what the French were good at. Eventually, this is what you need to advance. And this is what the Continentals were better to. France, more in mechanical stuff, the Germans more in chemical, but basically Britain was left behind. And so, as I said, you know, by 1914, Britain's lead was essentially eroded. And so, I want to end, however, in sort of doing a little chapeau for Britain, because the post, now it's not just the post-Brexit disastrous performance of the British economy. It really goes back all the way to 1918 and on and on and on. But you should always remember this. I wrote this, ladies and gentlemen, 45 years ago, and I still stand by it. What ultimately matters is the irreversibility of the events. Even if Britain's relative position in the developed world has declined in recent decades, this was written, as I said, in 1980, it has remained an urban and sophisticated society, wealthy beyond the wildest dream of the Britain of 1750, or the bulk of inhabitants of Africa or Southern Asia in our own time. Britain taught Europe, and Europe taught the world how the miracles of technological progress, free enterprise, and efficient management can break the shackles of poverty and want. Once the world has learned that lesson, it is unlikely to be ever forgotten. Thank you.